Howdy, my name is Patrick Neff, and along with my partner, Katie, we're bringing you a summary of Chapter 8 about assessments. Now, the first question to ask is, what is assessment? The dictionary defines it as the act or instance of making a judgment about something. In the classroom, we often use assessment to make a judgment about where our students are, in relation to not only where they should be, but in relation to where they started. There are two types of assessment that will be used traditionally in the classroom: formative and summative. I'm going to start with formative and then move on to summative assessment. So formative assessment is an ongoing process used in the classroom. Formative assessment focuses on observation, activities, other things that the teachers carry out. It's very informal. It's focused more on getting an idea of where students are at. Oftentimes there's no grade attached, or if there is a grade, it's participation, completion grades. And it's part of the instructional process. This is a big point because formative assessment needs to be done during instruction. If the teacher only becomes aware of problems after instruction, it becomes more difficult to reinforce correct ideas, correct false assumptions, things like that. There are some strategies recommended for formative assessment. The primary model that we'll see is the one offered by Atkin, Black, and Coffey. Shows up on page 277 of your textbook. And they ask three simple questions that should be how formative assessment is laid out. The first is, where are you trying to go? Now this works a lot like the backwards design process for those who've spent time in curriculum and instruction classes, where you start with what is the goal, what is the finish line, and then where are you now? The second question is part of that formative assessment. You might do pre-testing or questioning at the beginning of an instructional unit to determine what knowledge students already have. And once you know where you are now and where you're trying to go, the final question is, how do we get there? In this case, we're considering what vehicles we might take to arrive at our destination, what lessons, what information is important, how to present it, things like that. Alignment is a big and important part of the assessment process, both formative and summative. There are a lot of different components to alignment, different ways to approach it. So a learning progression, for example, would be an agreed upon standard set of skills, the order in which they should be followed or taught, and this provides kind of a roadmap for how to get where you're going. Prior learning is an important part of aligning what's being taught. If you don't know where your students are starting at, it's very difficult to direct them forward. It's very difficult to build if they don't have the prerequisite knowledge. This is a place where early formative assessment and pre-testing can be very helpful in determining what students know and how to and what to build off of. Of special note with prior learning, it's important to pay attention not only to what students know, but to where they may be mistaken. Incorrect knowledge that they have stored can be a problem and make it more difficult for them to learn new information, especially if it contradicts what their prior learning already tells them. In keeping with the idea of aligning standards, aligning goals so that our instruction and our assessment, both formative and summative, line up, explicit criteria are very important. Students need to know what's expected of them, what they're going to be tested on. We've all had that class, whether it be high school or college or even at a younger age, where a teacher comes in and gives a lesson every day and then shows up on Friday with a test that does not match up at all with the information that was provided. Or expect an essay when students have been filling out multiple choice or true false. So it's important to have explicit criteria, an idea of what standards will be kept, what goals there are, and rubrics are a really good way to do this. They give, especially in more non-specific areas, things that are more judgment calls on the teacher's part, it's important for both the students and the teachers to have something to point to as, here's how you are graded, here's what is important about the grading, these are the things I'm looking for, this is what a good paper looks like, this is what a bad paper looks like. So that explicit criteria can really help align your standards from start to finish, and rubrics are a really good way of doing that. Feedback is a very important part of the formative assessment process. Feedback needs to be very specific. You can't just provide feedback at any given moment. The book cautions against general praise or praising someone's effort, and especially against feedback that isn't true. It's important instead to focus on things like what specifically the student is doing well, what specifically they need to work on, and then beyond that to provide specific guidance on how to improve, how to get better. Studies have shown that this will help students become more self-directing and also help with staying focused and actually aligning with the standards that are expected. Finally, student self-assessment is kind of the end goal of formative assessment and alignment, is when students know where the teacher is starting and where they're trying to get to. When they've been taught these tools, things like rubrics, had the chance to critique their own work, it gives them the ability to begin doing that without teacher involvement as much. And it's a metacognitive tool that has been shown to help improve overall achievement and learning for students. And it's a tool that they will only develop if given the opportunity to practice often. So let's move on to summative assessments. Summative assessments are going to be your final judgment of, did the student master the material? Did they learn the material that was presented? Often we think of tests, essays, papers. Most often, summative assessments are going to be for some kind of a grade, where formative is often informal, summative is very formalized. And there are a couple of things that summative assessment is really good for. The first is looking at the difference between surface and deep learning. Depending on how your summative assessment is designed, and this comes back to the alignment piece we were just discussing, if the test is a lot of multiple choice and true-false, you have a good chance of getting surface learning, but not necessarily deep learning. So it's important when designing a summative assessment, be it a test, a paper, an essay, anything like that, that it be aligned not only with the specific things you want students to learn, but also with the goal of deep learning. So that you're asking students for those higher order thinking skills that Bloom talked about, the higher portions of the pyramid of the taxonomy. The second part to consider is grades and motivation. Obviously, most summative assessments are for a grade. However, research has shown that grades, especially bad grades or unearned grades, can be very demotivating for students. It can often give students the feeling that they are not achieving, that they're not accomplishing. And if the assessment is poorly designed, or it is not presented in such a way to give students a chance to improve, it can be very difficult to keep students motivated. One of the main ways in which to keep students motivated when looking at grades and especially summative assessment is to create summative assessments that are diverse, give students some chances, and this ties in with the opportunities to show mastery. Give them options, give them ways to take ownership of their learning and presenting knowledge. Work on offering opportunities for them to improve, give substantive feedback on their strengths and weaknesses, and again, guidance on how to move forward. If a student, as we saw with our previous learning from Dr. Dweck, if a student is shown that there's a pathway to moving forward and there's room for growth, they're more likely to be motivated and involved. And assessments have to align with these principles. The opportunities to show mastery, what's important here is making sure students understand what's being asked of them, and then that they're given the chance to show that they understand. This can be especially important for students with learning disabilities or students who maybe have a difficulty such as dyslexia or dysgraphia. Asking them to write something out may be difficult, but giving them the opportunity to present verbally or perhaps show some other way that they have mastered the material, you're more likely to get, again, back to the motivation, and also for your assessment to be more effective. Large-scale assessment is a form of summative assessment that is often decried. It's also generally referred to as standardized testing. These standardized tests might be statewide, nationwide, or even worldwide tests that are designed to gather data on where students are over time, changes in student accomplishment or achievement, making sure that students are gaining. Often the early goal of these large-scale assessments was, along with making learning objectives more rigorous. In the late 80s and early 90s, the push, part of it had to do with diversity and the way in which minority students were often showing less steps forward, and these tests were designed to provide data, information on how we might approach the problems and what standards we were missing. However, there have been some problems with large-scale assessment, and ask any teacher in a classroom what they think of the standardized tests their students take, and you'll likely not hear anything good. Part of the reason for this is that while the goal of these assessments might be to judge where students are at and whether they're making adequate progress, they've become, thanks to budget concerns and other problems, they tend towards multiple choice questions, very surface level assessment, and so it leads to issues with the testing culture that's built up. Students are often taught specific testing strategies for significant portions of their class time. They are trained to take a test rather than to learn and master the material. And so that culture that has sprung up, because so many of these tests are high stakes and have consequences for the schools, they don't often meet the goals that they were originally envisioned to achieve. Instead, they tend to have negative impacts on the classroom as far as what's being taught and how it's being taught. Again, with the motivating factor, the score that students receive can be seen as demotivational for the student because it shows that they failed at the subject after spending a whole year of studying it, or that they are not as smart as their classmates because there's only one way to show any kind of learning or mastery. So there are a lot of issues with large-scale assessment. When it's done well, it can provide good information and point educators in a direction that allows them to improve upon what they're doing and make good, smart choices about what areas they most need to improve upon. When done poorly, they frustrate everyone, including educators and students, without providing any useful information. So this has been a quick rundown of the assessment chapter, Chapter 8. There is a lot more information out there. I do recommend looking into it. The articles for this week would be a good place to start. But thank you for your time. Hopefully you've learned something, and we look forward to seeing you in the discussion forums.